event brought to you by the United States Heartland China Association. The topic today is a conversation about the myth of Chinese capitalism, the first book of Dexter Roberts, to be hosted by Professor He Zhiguo from University of Chicago. My name is Min Fan. I'm the executive director of United States Heartland China Association. We are a 501c3 grassroots nonprofit, and we believe that not all bridges are built of concrete steel. Some bridges are built of people and Zoom, like today. So we are honored to bring to you Dexter Tiff Roberts, who is an award-winning writer and speaker on China, and now serving as a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council Asia Security Initiative, and also fellow at the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center, and adjunct instructor in political science at University of Montana. His bio is much longer than what you see here, but we'll touch the highlights. He was a bureau chief and Asia news editor at Bloomberg Business Week, based in Beijing for more than 2 decades. He has reported from all of China's provinces and regions, including Tibet and Xinjiang, covering the rise of companies, entrepreneurs, manufacturing migrants, demography and civil society, and politics and security. He has also reported from North Korea, Mongolia, and Cambodia on China's growing economic and political influence. Dexter, you have lived a fascinating life. Love to have you back later at a different event. And to host Dexter today, we have with us Professor He Zhiguo, who is a financial economist serving at the Fuji Bank and Heller Professor of Finance at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, where he has taught since 2008. He looks a lot younger. We were joking that Professor He might have started teaching when he was in undergrad, but he served as director of Becker Friedman Institute China and co-director of Fama Miller Center. He is also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, member of the Academy Committee at the Luohan Academy, and special term Alibaba Foundation Professor of Finance at Tsinghua University. With that, I'm going to turn over to Professor He to lead us through the rest of the program.
Thanks a lot for the audience to come here and joining us together with the award-winning writer Dexter for the next hour that we were chatting about the migrant workers and the myth of the Chinese capitalism. So the plan will be that I let the Dexter to show us some of the slides that he prepared, and that will guide our discussion for the next hour. Dexter, during the time, if you have some questions, feel free to type in, and I might I can moderate in a timely way. Dexter, please.
Okay, well, thank you very much to both of you for this opportunity, and to the U.S. Heartland China Association. I am now, as was mentioned earlier, based in Montana. So I'm not sure we're included formally in the organization, but we certainly belong in there. We're part of the Heartland as well. So I think, yes, as Professor He said, I'll start by showing you some slides from my book and use that as a way to talk about our topic today. I'm going to try to start sharing my screen right now. Okay. Okay, so I guess the best way to start this, I would like to talk about the origins of how I came to write my book, The Myth of Chinese Capitalism. And to do so, I have to take all of us back quite a few years to the year 2000. I had then been based in China for about 5 years. I came in the beginning of 1995. And during those first 5 years, I was working for Business Week magazine, later to become Bloomberg Business Week. I was very focused on writing about urban China and the cities of China. If you think back to those years, there was already a growing, a strong and growing presence of foreign multinationals, including American companies investing in China. But again, it was much smaller than today. It wasn't until about 5 years later that China was to enter the World Trade Organization, and that there would be a flood of foreign investment into China. But I've been there, as I said, basically focused on writing about companies, often about American companies, as an American business publication, and really focusing on the cities. I was based in Beijing and also did a lot of traveling to places like Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen, as one might imagine. But in the year 2000, for the very first time, I was to visit southwestern China. And this is, of course, the interior of China, if the heartland of China, if you will. I went to visit Guizhou province. It was the first time I had ever been to Guizhou, first time I'd actually been to the Southwest, and or as a journalist, the first time I'd been to the Southwest. And I actually was working on 2 cover stories at the time for Business Week. You can see the first one here, pictured in the slide. It was called China's Wealth Gap. And the story that I was working, the story, of course, was on China's wealth gap. If you think back again to that year, 2000, we had, of course, a different leader in China. It was then Party General Secretary Jiang Zemin. And he had recently launched a new policy for China called Develop the West. And Develop the West was an effort to try to develop the West, develop the interior of China, and begin to see some of the non-coastal interior provinces of China, like Guizhou, start to catch up with the coast. We're already at that point more than a couple decades into the reform and opening policy that was launched by former Paramount leader Deng Xiaoping in 1978. And if you remember Deng's many very colorful aphorisms that he used to describe his policymaking, one of them was, let some people get rich first. And that is exactly what had happened in China. With reform and opening throughout the 80s, many people had gotten much wealthier, but much of it had been focused along the coastal, in the coastal provinces and along in the big cities of China. So by the year 2000, there was this awareness that not everyone was getting rich quite fast enough. And so therefore, this new policy, Develop the West, was launched to try to deal with that wealth gap. Later that same year in 2000, I was back in Guizhou for another story. You can see the cover story here for Business Week, pictured called The Great Migration. And what I was focusing on was the already very large migration of young people from those poorer interior provinces like Guizhou to the coastal regions as factories were opened there and new economic opportunities opened up. Already there were probably some 200 million migrants who were leaving those poorer parts of China and looking for work along the coast. And for this same story of the Great Migration, I went to another place as well. I went to this small village in Guizhou, which a bunch of migrants were all from, economic migrants who had traveled to do factory work. And as it turned out, almost all of them had gone to the same place in China, and that was Dongguan in Guangdong province, also known as Factory to the World, probably the densest factory zone in the world for manufacturing, and mainly export manufacturing. So that year in 2000, I went to Dongguan. I met these young people that were all from Guizhou, and then later that same year went and met them in their village in Guizhou, or met a couple of them who were back in their village in Guizhou. So through my book, I really focus on these 2 places. One is this village in Guizhou, which I visited for the first time in 2000. It's called the Binghua Village, or Binghua Cun, and it's in the southeast part of the province, very close to the border with Guangxi. Quite remote feeling then. To get there then, I actually, it's quite a memorable trip. I flew from Beijing to Guiyang, the provincial capital. I then took a train down out of Guiyang, a little bit south in the province, changed to a truck, and then the very last part of the visit or the trip to get to Binghua Cun involved a pony cart. And that's because the roads were dirt and they were very, very muddy. And I actually had my laptop, I remember, with me. So I was in the, for about 2 hours at the end of the trip in a pony cart. So that's how I got to Binghua. The other picture in the slide here is actually in Guangzhou. So it's not in Dongguan, which is the city that I really focus on in my book, along with this village of Binghua. But just up the coast, up the Pearl River Delta from Dongguan. And this was a picture. This is a much more recent picture. Actually, both these pictures are recent in the last 5 years. And the one from Guangzhou is factory workers at a SUV factory, actually, Guangzhou Auto, between shift. And so those would be obviously the migrant workers of today, pictured here. So there are a number of these migrants that I first met in the year 2000 that I was really lucky to get to know them. They're great people, and was able to stay in touch with them, become friends really, and follow that sort of the arc of their adult lives from the year 2000 until just a few years ago when I left China. And one of the people, and I write about them in China, they all happen to have the same surname of Mo, which is pretty common in villages in China, where most people will share the same surname and be distantly related. So this young man, Mo Rubo, this picture is from 2000. I met him in Dongguan. I didn't have a chance at meeting him in his village of Binghua on this first visit. But he was working, as you can see here, as a welder in a Taiwanese-owned electronics factory. And over the years, I met Rubo probably dozens of times, and both met him in Dongguan, where he still lives today, but also in the village of Binghua. Another picture here. I should note that all these pictures, many of which appear in black and white form in my book, are from a photographer named Greg Girard. I must give him credit. He's an extremely skilled photographer who spent many years in Asia and many years focused on photographing China. He's Vancouver, British Columbia based. But anyway, he was very kind to allow me to use some of those photos that he first took on the trip. He actually accompanied me on that trip in 2000 when he was working for Business Week on that photo shoot. So this picture here is Mo Rubo on the streets of Dongguan with his girlfriend at the time, who's another migrant worker, but not from Guizhou, but from another province, from Heartland, up to the north, also largely agricultural, and also a source of many migrants, young people who would leave Heartland, which was not very wealthy, and go to the coasts to find work. So here, this picture is from Binghua. The young woman in the red vest, Mo Meiquan, is another person I got to know and who I profile in my book. And she was back in the village. So I had met her earlier in Dongguan along with Rubo, her distant cousin. And then I was very lucky when I later went to the village of Binghua, and also in 2000 to see her there. She was back for two reasons. One was to help her parents with a rice harvest. Most of the village was still focused on subsistence agriculture. And so she was back to help them do that. The other reason she was back was because she was renewing her identity card. And back in that year, 2000, the early 2000s, unfortunately, migrant workers were very vulnerable when they would go and work in the cities. And one of the things that would happen, which was pretty much the worst fate they could imagine, is they could get picked up by local police. And if, for example, they had an expired identity card, or if their household registration was expired, or they weren't carrying the proper documentation on them, they could actually be thrown into what were then called these black jails. And a number of years later, under another former leader, former premier Wen Jiabao, they actually abolished these black jails. But at that point, this was a real fear of a migrant worker, and so they actually both her and Rubo had another cousin from the village who had actually been picked up and ended up being asked to pay several months of salary to get basically sort of a shakedown by local police before he was released. So she was back also renewing her identity card. So on this same visit, again, it was in the year 2000, you may be surprised to know that many of the villagers I met, and particularly the village chief, were talking about China's soon imminent entry into the World Trade Organization. And so again, if you remember the history of this, China wasn't to enter the World Trade Organization until late 2001, about a year after I visited Binghua, this village in Guizhou, for the first time. But what had already happened was the US and China had signed the bilateral accession agreement that would allow China to enter the WTO. And that agreement committed both the US and particularly China to opening all sorts of parts of its economy, including agriculture, telecoms, finance, to foreign investment, and lifting tariffs. So this was a different era of slashing tariffs rather than the unfortunate last couple of years we've seen of the tariff war, where there's been competitive piling on of tariffs. But at this point, both the US and China had committed to opening access to their economies, and this would help China then enter the WTO in late 2001. China already knew, officials knew in China that they were on course to enter the World Trade Organization. And there was actually an educational movement throughout amongst local officials in China to study how they could benefit from China's entry into the World Trade Organization. So when I was talking to this village chief in this quite remote village, he wanted to talk to me about WTO entry. And one of the reasons he wanted to talk to a foreign journalist and an American journalist was his hope that perhaps appearing in a business magazine, an international business magazine, that actually might bring investment to his village. And he was very much hoping then they would get money for a vegetable and fruit processing factory, so that they could move up the value-added chain, start producing value-added fruits and vegetables, and potentially provide jobs for their young people. So not all their young people would have to leave and seek jobs in places like Dongguan. At that point, pretty much everyone that was capable, that was young, was leaving to try to find factory or construction work. So as I mentioned, about a year later, late 2001, China enters the World Trade Organization. This is another cover story I worked on for Business Week, or I wrote for Business Week. This, I think everyone knows about this. After the conclusion of the successful negotiations, China's on track to enter. It enters. Tariffs on multiple products are reduced. Tens of thousands of new coastal export factories are set up in China, drawing in millions more migrant workers. So that phenomenon I had just written about, called the Great Migration, became much greater and much bigger after WTO entry. Foreign investment jumped in China from $47 billion in 2001, the year China entered the WTO, to $124 billion a decade later. Living standards went up across China. Phenomenal economic growth, as we all know, and tremendous progress in lifting living standards, and much of it, driven by a whole series of economic reforms in China, including also, I should note, the movement of people from largely agricultural, subsistence agricultural work into new industrial jobs, these migrants, along with China's WTO entry, unleashed new waves of productivity, which brought this tremendous growth to China that we all know about. So jumping forward many years, this picture was taken shortly before I left China, which was a little under 3 years ago. And this is taken not far from this village of Binghua. This shows you another way that China has driven its economic progress along with reform, and that is by this tremendous infrastructure build out that all of us around the world know about today. Here's an example of one of the huge expressways that have been built all over the country, including in places like Guizhou, which are much poorer and landlocked and relatively remote. And of course, we know all about China's tremendous progress on building high-speed rail. And there's also high-speed rail in Guizhou as well now. If you look closely at this picture, you can see a billboard. I think it's the lettering is, the characters are too small to read, but the fact that it's red and gold is a dead giveaway. It's propaganda, party propaganda. I believe it was a Xi Jinping slogan. So the other thing we've seen in China today is, along with this infrastructure build out across the country, is a big push of now of ideology and propaganda throughout the country. This year, 2021, as some of you may know, is the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. The actual birthday of the 100th birthday of the Communist Party will come on July 1st. They founded the Chinese Communist Party July 1st, 1921. And for that 100th anniversary, China has set some centenary or 100-year goals. And many of them are economics based. So there was the goal set to quadruple the economy from the year 2000 to 2020, and specifically double the size of the economy from 2010 to 2020. Another centenary goal is to double average GDP per capita. So the average amount of money earned by people in China between 2010 and 2020. And the third one, which we've heard a lot about recently, was to end extreme poverty in China. Well, they just announced that they have ended extreme poverty, a tremendous achievement. In terms of the doubling of the economy and also doubling of average GDP per capita, I believe both are happening right now. So tremendous progress, obviously, economic progress over the last decade and over the couple decades since I first visited Guizhou in the year 2000. And by the way, I came back and visited Guizhou more than a dozen times over the years. So I was able to watch the changes there, which were very, very real. But at the same time, I would like to highlight another statistic, which is not as happy of one. And that is back in 2000, when I was working on this Develop the West story, one of the statistics I was always told by local officials, and I heard this when I went to Guizhou, was that the average gap between someone born in rural China and someone from urban China was 1 to 3. So your average city resident in China was making about 3 times as much on average as someone from the countryside. And this was part of, I was told again and again that Develop the West and other policies that were later to come aimed to narrow this gap and potentially even end this gap. Well, the unfortunate reality is today that gap is still about 1 to 3. So that they really have not made progress on that. It might be 1 to 2.7 or something. So it's still very, very much there. If you look more broadly at the wealth gap in China, and this may not surprise everyone, maybe surprise some of you, it's actually far, far larger than it was back in 2000. So China today, and there's been interesting research done by a lot of inequality experts, including those within China, Professor Li Shi in Beijing and another Professor Gan Li in Chengdu. They've all looked at inequality in China, both income and wealth inequality, and then also some outside researchers, including Thomas Piketty, the noted income inequality expert. What most of them have found is very large inequality, very large wealth inequality, and fast growing. And according to Piketty's calculations, China today has wealth inequality that is similar to what Russia has. And I think that's rather dramatic when you think about it, because we think about, some people call it kleptocratic Russia. There's been a huge surge in the wealth gap in Russia, but unfortunately China has a similar gap, and it's growing about as fast as it grows in Russia. So one of the things that I looked at in my book, I set about to try to understand, is why, despite all these very impressive efforts to lift living standards, many of which have succeeded, we've actually seen at the same time this growing wealth gap, which is becoming actually far, far worse than it used to be in China today. China is actually one of the most unequal societies in the world now, if you talk to most economists about the wealth gap there. And so the argument I make in my book is that there are a couple legacy policies, and I call them legacy policies because they actually date back many, many decades, back to the Mao era, before Deng Xiaoping even showed up. And although these policies have changed to a degree, they still exist. And the two policies I really focus on, one is the household registration policy, or in Chinese, the hukou policy. And this was originally put in place by Mao, in effect, to ensure that rural people in China would not leave rural China. As everyone who's looked at the history of China would know, China organized its rural society in communes, where large numbers of people would produce agriculture there. And Mao wanted to ensure that those people in rural China would basically be stuck there so that they could help produce low-cost food for the rest of China, for urban China. And this was to help power the industrialization of China, which was one of Mao's most primary goals. And so the household registration policy still exists today. And there's been a huge change in what it does. As I've just been talking about, and as I write about in my book, China has one of the largest internal migrant populations, probably 300 million plus people now can be classified as economic migrants within China. So the household registration is certainly not keeping people in the countryside. That's not what it's doing at all. But what the household registration policy still does today is it is basically determines the social welfare benefits and the access that every Chinese person gets to social welfare benefits. It makes sure that is tied to the place that they are born, or even where their parents were born. And so what does that mean? That means that, in effect, most migrants of China and their cousins back in the countryside, which, by the way, if you add together the 300 million or so migrants, plus those people still living in rural China, you get up to 500-600 million people. So getting close to half of China's population. So what the household registration does is it means that in most cases, in order to access healthcare, migrants, they struggle to get access to good quality healthcare in the cities. In theory, they should, in most cases, get access to healthcare back where they come from, in the villages. Probably even more dramatically, it restricts where their children can go to school. So in most cases, the children of migrants are not able to go to public schools in the city. And that's led to something that's not just an economic issue for China, but is also a human rights issue, I would say, which is what Chinese call the left behind child phenomena. And depending on who you talk to, there are up to some 100 million young people that are the children of migrants that grow up apart from their parents. And that's, again, because they cannot easily get into public schools in the cities. In many cases, they're in these rather impersonal, large boarding schools in the countryside, of which a number I've visited over the years. And their parents will only get to see them once a year, usually during the Lunar New Year, when these migrant workers are able to go back to the villages to see their relatives and to see their children. So the other legacy policy I focus on in my book is the dual land policy. This, again, is a policy that dates back to the Mao era. What it does is officially all land in rural China is defined as belonging to the collective, which is a throwback to when there were collectives related and communes. And what that means in effect is that it is very hard for your average rural person, and this includes migrant workers who typically will have a small plot of land back in the countryside. very small often, very, very fragmented agriculture in rural China. And so whereas they'll have this plot of land that they can farm, it's very difficult for them to actually rent it or sell it at anything close to market rates. This is because of restrictions, because it technically belongs to the collective. The farmers themselves and the migrants do not have this right to sell it into other use, like into industrial use, where a factory could be built, or into commercial use, where it might a building might be built, a mall or residential, or whatever it might be. And this stands in great contrast to urban China, where, as many of you probably know, there's been an explosion of wealth, largely based on people buying and selling their apartments. They have, in most cases, they'll have a 70-year lease. So it's not a freehold. It's not like in the United States where they own it forever. But in most cases, the assumption has been that after those 70 years, the government will roll over the 70-year rights. And if, in effect, they've been able to go ahead and sell their property, their apartments at market rates. And this distinction between the ability to sell land at a market rate in the cities and not being able to do that in the countryside actually lies at the heart of the wealth gap today in China. So even as rural people have done better and gotten wealthier, they've just simply not been able to grow their incomes like people in rural China. I should note as well that rural land, it does make it into the market. It's just not the migrants and the farmers that typically benefit. What happens is local officials will, in effect, reclassify land from agricultural to industrial or commercial use, which they can do. And they will usually pay the farmers or the migrants a nominal fee for the land. And then once they've reclassified it, they're able to sell it at many multiples more and make a lot of money. And actually, this has become a very important source of local revenues, of township revenues across China, basically selling and renting land. It just hasn't benefited the migrants and the workers very much. Well, as I finish up here, I'll just say this is a recent picture, about 3 years old, of me visiting with Rubo, the young man who was the welder in the earlier slide. Here he is. He's living not far from the original Taiwanese-owned electronics factory that I met him in, where he was a welder. But now he's a small entrepreneur. He actually has a clothing apparel label, not one that any of you would have ever heard of, not even a label that your average Beijinger or a person from Shanghai would have ever heard of, but very small. And they source the apparel from different factories, and then they sell their brand online. The woman with him is his former girlfriend, who's from Heartland, who we saw in the earlier picture as well. They're now married, and the last person, as you no doubt can guess, is their daughter. And during this visit in 2018, I think, they were struggling with the question of where their daughter would go to school. She was 5 years old. She's about ready to enter primary school. And both Rubo and his wife were adamant that they did not want her to go back to the village and become a left behind child. So the other option for migrant families in the cities, because they can't, in most cases, put their kids in public school, is to put them in these private schools that cater to migrant workers that have been set up in many places where migrant workers live. And the problem with those private schools is typically they're not very good quality. And actually they're quite expensive in many cases, unlike the much better, good public schools in the cities. So he was struggling with that. I actually spoke to him just a few weeks ago, and his daughter is in a private school that caters to migrant worker children in Dongguan. So they got her in a school, but it's tough to pay those costs. So I'll just finish by noting that these two continuing legacy policies, in effect, as I argue in my book, have ensured that a very large number of China's people are not really fully benefiting from the economic boom that the world is seeing over these years. And because they are still subject to the household registration policy and also the dual land policy. As I said earlier, their wealth, their family wealth is not growing at the same pace as those of people from the city. They also face potential high costs just getting by. So typically when you speak to a migrant worker family, in some cases a rural family as well, they will tell you that they save much of the money that they earn. And the reason they save it is because they know that it potentially could be very expensive, relatively expensive for their child to go to school. They know that if they have a sudden medical emergency and it happens in the city, they may end up having to spend a lot more money to pay for their medical costs than even some people in the cities with the city household registration will pay. So this is an economic dilemma for China today. China right now is trying to transition from an economy, an economic model, which as a shorthand I would call factory to the world, a economic model very reliant on trade, which has been very, very good for China over the years and good for its economy, but also is starting to show some signs of problems within it. And so one obvious thing we've seen over the last 2 years, of course, has been the trade war. China did do well exporting throughout the pandemic, selling electronic goods for people stuck at home around the world, selling PPE for people looking for things like masks and so on. But China's leaders are very aware that being this reliant on trade with the rest of the world is not a particularly stable way to develop the economy. They've also seen at the same time a very large and worrying buildup in debt. So now, according to most estimates, total debt in the Chinese economy is over 300% of GDP, and this is, many people believe, potentially destabilizing. So they have these goals to try to reduce debt. They want to move away from being such an export-oriented economy, and also stop being so reliant on manufacturing. China wants to continue to be a very big manufacturer. As we know, they have a whole policy called Made in China 2025, which is supposed to support a more modern manufacturing sector. By the way, one that'll be much more automated with far fewer migrant workers. But they also at the same time are trying to grow their service economy. They've made great strides in that. And they're also, a key goal is to increase the proportion of the economy that is driven by the spending power of China's own people. China today has struggled to actually lift the proportion of GDP built up by household spending. It's still, I think, just under 40% of GDP. That's actually low compared to many countries around the world, including other developing countries. And as I argue in my book, I believe that has a lot to do with the continuing power of these legacy policies that make it hard for migrants and rural people to become full spending consumers in the new economy. So China is trying to make that transition towards a much more domestic-driven economy, much more service-driven economy, and they are making progress, but they are running up against this obstacle of the fact that household consumption is really not keeping up with the growth that they've seen. So I think I should probably stop here because we don't have that much time tonight, and to turn to the more interesting part, which will be talking to Professor He and hopefully hearing some audience questions.
Thanks a lot, Dexter, for this excellent talk of the summary of the, I like your summary of these two policies and also the started with these interesting stories, that the personal stories to the real person in these two cities. Let me just, just one big question, which is, you were talking about this Chinese myth of the myth of Chinese capitalism. What do you exactly mean? I'm an economist, so I would try to figure out, what is it? What do you mean that it's different from the rest of the world, or it's similar, or it's just a similar logic but with different ingredients? I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes. So the Myth of Chinese Capitalism, the title of my book, is really a stand-in for a couple different myths that I deal with. Capitalism in my book is, I guess you can see it as shorthand for economic reform. And one of the arguments I make in my book is that whereas much of the modern growth we've seen, the growth we've seen in China's modern economy has been built on economic reform, first started under Deng Xiaoping. Things like the household responsibility system, which was the breaking up of the communes and allowing farmers to decide themselves what to plant and where to sell it. A quick run through it. The growth of the township and village enterprises, which was basically rural companies, state enterprise reform, China's entry into the World Trade Organization, and also this huge movement of people from subsistence jobs in agriculture into industry. All these things unleash these waves of productivity, which have driven growth and really been based on these series of economic reforms. What I argue in my book is that over the last 7 or so years, we have not seen these economic reforms continue at the pace that we had seen before. And indeed, in a number of areas, we've seen a reversal, a move, for example, towards giving precedence once more to state enterprises for large sectors of the economy, new pressures being put on private enterprises, things like an effort to get more and more private enterprises to open party committees or party organizations within them. And altogether, I see this as a move away from the economic reforms. And by the way, I think we're already seeing the results of that. China, since about 2007, has seen a dramatic drop in productivity in the economy. 70% of GDP growth, according to one of the top experts on this, Professor Lauren Brandt, before 2007 was based on productivity in the economy. That's gone to very small, perhaps even to zero now. So they really aren't seeing the productivity in the economy. And I think that has to do with this move away from reform, or in the telling of my book, away from Chinese capitalism. Another big myth that I talk about, which I see as one that is very popular around the world. And this is the idea that China's middle class, which has already been growing in leaps and bounds and has gotten very large, hundreds of millions of people. Every consultancy seems to have a different estimate, but it's very large. There's been this idea that inevitably it will just keep growing. And what I argue in my book is that this is not the case. The middle class in China will not continue growing until China finds a way to better integrate rural China, rural people, and the migrants who come from rural China into the economy. And I would argue we're already seeing examples of that happening right now. We've also seen over the last year, by the way, during the pandemic, we saw this very remarkable jump back in the Chinese economy. I think the first quarter of this year was 18.3% growth, in part because of the base effect of such terrible, a collapse in growth in the first quarter of last year. But China said that, they set a target for 6% growth for the year. They'll easily meet it. But the fact of the matter is, if you look more closely, you will see debt once again is growing in the economy, which is something they have been trying to stop. We've also seen this exacerbation of some of the existing inequalities in the economy as well, which is bad news for a future middle class. And that is the fact that if you look at low incomes of lower of people that don't make as much money in China, including particularly migrant workers, there's been real stagnation. It has not been growing. Whereas if you look at incomes at the upper end of society in China, there's been much stronger growth. So anyway, that other myth is this myth that China will just continue minting new members of its middle class. And I argue that's not going to happen without these reforms that I talk about.
So this is related to the, do you think that, this question may be a little bit tougher. Do you think Beijing knew it? Or they disagree with you?
No, they agree. My argument is I learned from Beijing from officials in China. Since 2013, there was a third one of the big party plenums. It was a third plenum, so it was focused on the economy.
I was there in Beijing.
Yes, and if you will remember, they announced this tremendously ambitious blueprint for reform, and in this blueprint, they talk specifically about the need to boost consumption, domestic consumption in the economy. They're very aware that China's domestic consumption as a proportion of GDP is still low compared to the rest of the world. In that document, they specifically talk about the need to reform and ultimately probably end both the hukou, or the household registration policy, and the dual land policy. And they also point out that those policies restrict the consumption ability of large numbers of Chinese people. So this is an argument that the Chinese government itself has been making repeatedly. And they have tried in a number of ways to, periodically they will announce new efforts to bring together the land policy so there's not a distinction between urban and rural land. And they often talk about new changes to the hukou policy that are, for example, allowing migrants to settle in cities and get better access to social welfare. But my reading of it, and a lot of economists that I mentioned in my book that are far smarter than me, will say that it's really been piecemeal. And we've seen actually limited progress in these reforms that they laid out very clearly in 2013. We're now 7 years later, 8 years later, and they still are struggling with these same issues.
But you see that so as a native Chinese, and often the time also I came from a city, Shaoxing, which when I was very, very young was kind of Shaoxing is a city that is close to Hangzhou, which nowadays everybody knew. But at that time that I feel like myself will be classified as a rural area. And now clearly it become the urban. So a lot of times that the growth is perhaps on this urbanization, which if you look at the city, if you look at a place where always being urban, then I would agree with you largely that look at the right. So urban and the rural area inequality going up, but often the time the calculation missing the point that there are lots of places initially counted as rural now become urbanized, and that is perhaps a very big portion of the growth. So this is why that a lot of times that I would like to push a bit, saying that okay, part of the economic growth is on this part, and you also mentioning all these like infrastructure investment that's even benefit all the rural part of it. With that caveats into your thinking, would you and together with the fact that it seems like what happens nowadays that you got people kind of like support of the whole policy. I meant like if you randomly interview somebody on the street, I do not know if you agree with that. I'm not exactly sure, but let's take that as a given. Do you think that the overall slow policy, slowly rolled out, as you said, a piecemeal, is it a success or is a failure?
I think it's a failure. China is not making progress on lifting household consumption as a proportion of the economy. You look at the big numbers as an economist. There are other reasons for that, but that's a failure. They've been trying to do that for years and it hasn't budged above 40% of GDP. So I think that's a problem. I think the piecemeal policies suffer from very much a top-down mentality where China will say, oh, here's a city that we think could use some migrants. In some cases, they've chosen cities where there are economic problems. The economy's bad. It might even be an excess of housing. They're like, we have too many. It might be, you know, the classic ghost city in China. We need more people in this city because there's vacant apartments and the economy is not doing well. Let's actually allow these migrants to move to this city. Well, that begs the question of what are they going to do? What kind of job are they going to get? And how are they possibly going to buy a vacant apartment if they don't, you know, if they don't have a good source of income there? There's been very much Beijing designates which cities will grow, and those aren't always the places that migrants want to go. Now, the cities, the showcase cities, which have been the largest magnets for migrants, are actually to the contrary, are actually in many cases trying to reduce their populations. So the real big ones like Beijing and Shanghai, they've actually set negative population growth goals, and they have put in place policies to drive out migrants. Now, there's a reason migrants want to go to those cities. There's economic opportunity there. But according to the vision in Beijing, Beijing's already too big. We have a problem with pollution. We have a problem with traffic. We have too many people here. I mean, it's such a top-down mentality that they've actually created, this massive. They have this idea, Xi Jinping does, of creating Xiong'an and a massive new city out in the farmland in Hebei, and he wants to move all the quote-unquote non-essential functions of the city there. So anyway, I think it's very much top-down. Places like Shenzhen, where many migrants, I know many migrants in Shenzhen as well. It's virtually impossible for them to actually get.
Good. So
can I just say, Shaoxing is not what I'm talking about. Shaoxing's been around forever. It's famous. Lu Xun wrote about. It's not the rural China I'm talking about. I mean, it's got a long, strong economic history. I'm talking about places like in Guizhou, parts of Henan, and throughout the interior of China.
Yeah. So,
but Shaoxing is beautiful, by the way. That's a great place to be.
The last point that then I will move on to just you mentioned top down. Let me mention one policy that Beijing would like to do the top down, but didn't succeed, or at least have not succeeded yet. The housing tax policy, and the reason is there are lots of resistance from the local or from many other parts of the incumbents existing interest groups. It's also related to this hukou restriction. Clearly, there are a lot of people who are pushing for, partially abolish it, but there are many people resist on that, given all these benefits there are. So I view that Beijing is playing extremely careful policy movement, and occasionally Xi Jinping has the power to push out something, in a way that are more dramatic than people thought. I view that those things are itself is a trade-off or balanced act out of an extremely complicated benefit splitting game that the whole country is playing. But you feel like maybe there are a better way to deal with that. Is that when you say that it's a failure in the sense of slow moving process, that you think there would be a much better way to deal with it, or not?
I probably shouldn't have said failure. You asked me if I thought it was a success or a failure. So I think it's more mixed than that, but it's certainly
good.
I think there's you mentioned how complicated it is. I completely agree. One of the biggest obstacles to allowing migrants into cities is urban residents who have no desire to share their hospitals, their clinics, or their schools with migrant families.
Right.
The Beijing has, over the years, a number of times has tried to pursue these well-meaning policies to allow more migrant children into schools. And guess who went out and protested outside the education bureaus? This happened in Nanjing a few years ago. Parents of urban kids who, to be fair to them, already face tremendous competition in getting their kids into good schools in urban China, just competing with other kids from urban families. So the last thing they want to do is make it even more difficult by allowing migrant worker families in. So that's a huge obstacle that Beijing has dealt with. It's not popular amongst urbanites to allow rural people or migrants to settle in the cities. And that's just one example. You mentioned the property tax. I can't not mention the fact that a huge obstacle with the property tax is officials themselves who may own multiple apartments, and they do not want that revealed. So, I mean, this has been a struggle forever with attempts to sort of have sunshine policies on official finances and official, property holdings. Officials don't, it's very unpopular because they might have 5 apartments, and that doesn't look good if you're an official that's not being paid very much money for your salary.
Indeed, but I mentioned this is just try to tell people that it's not the case where whenever Xi Jinping wants to do it, then they will do it. That's the best example.
100% agree with. I 100% agree with you. It's that's got to be, along with probably running the United States. Those are running China those are the 2 hardest jobs in the world.
So there are a bunch of questions coming from the. Let me just mention one, and then we will probably just. I think will be useful to mention the most headline news nowadays about the demographic. Just 2 days ago, probably 2 days or 3 days ago, about the news report about the population drop. And today I heard that there was another news coming out saying that no, that's not true. That's funny. How do you think, in your 20 years of more than 20 years in China, do you really worry about it or feel about it? What's your conjecture down the road? How do they fix this problem?
I think the demographic challenge is one of the very biggest challenges facing China. And whether, I also saw the news that maybe it came out in a Financial Times report, and some people were saying that was inaccurate. But whether or not that one report was inaccurate, we all know that China is facing a tremendous demographic challenge. And it's this movement from what was a demographic dividend contributing to the economy to now some people call it a demographic time bomb. China, and to use the cliche that has been, which is very accurate, China runs the risk of becoming old before it becomes rich. So we have other countries around the world that have rapidly aging populations, but most of them don't have an average per capita income as low as China. And I think that's a tremendous burden for the economy. We're going to have a very, very large group of elderly people that have to be supported by a smaller and smaller number of workers. We actually are seeing a decline in the workforce. And one other thing about the workforce, it's rapidly aging, of course. So this, I believe, is a challenge to some of the very important goals for China, including its goal of becoming a more innovative economy. There's interesting research that shows that an aging workforce isn't necessarily very good for innovation. People often cite the example of Japan for this. Yeah. So I think there's multiple. I think it's an enormous challenge for China going forward. Obviously, they tried to deal with it to a degree by loosening the one-child policy a number of years ago, and they were very, alarmed to discover that that did not help very much in boosting birth rates. Most people in China have reached what they discovered, which is everyone in the world, is sort of a universal. As people become better off and better educated, they typically don't want to have such large families.
Extremely complicated by the fact that housing is too expensive.
Yes, and education we were talking about. It's so
education.
So,
yes,
yeah.
That's right. So we are almost done with the 1 hour. Really, thank you, Dexter, for the excellent talk, and it's an interesting exchange about your views about China. Ming, I'm gonna hand it over to you. We're gonna have a free participation of the bunch of friends coming in. Is that right?
Yeah. Before we let Dexter go, actually Dexter's now going. We'll have a small group discussion for our members, those who purchase his book, and some invited partner and guests. so they will be slowly moving in. But before we close the public program, I do want to ask Dexter one question, if you can answer it quickly. Is there a lesson through what you saw in China for the Heartland region in the United States? We are, some community we've been working with, they feel like they are in a third world country, the backyard of the United States. Are any lessons we could learn for this part of the United States?
That's a great question. I think there's, you asked me to keep my answer short, so I will. I think probably the best lesson we could take from China is infrastructure. And of course, this is something Biden's talking a lot about now. We have, as someone who lived in China for a couple decades, one of the shocking things to come back is to see the unfortunately decrepit state of American infrastructure in many places. So I think we need to fix our infrastructure, including in the heartland. And I think that alone would be a significant boost to economic growth. So I'll just leave it there. Very simple.
Great, thank you. So now I think our staff is going to move some of the folks into the small group. So feel free to grab a little water, and we will have some friends join us in a small group discussion. And so thank you for joining us if you're leaving.